I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as all the heavens were a bell and being but an ear, and I and silence, some strange race, wrecked, solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then.
So what's going on? I love Emily Dickinson. She's brilliant.
She is brilliant, but she's not always easy. It's like a code. It's like cracking a code. One of the things I love about this poem, one of the things I love about Dickinson is that she uses things that you can get your head around to articulate things that you can't. Or rather, what she does is she'll use an image like the image here of a funeral, in this instance as an extended metaphor, quite possibly for something else entirely. So she uses the concrete image of the funeral as to get to something more abstract about human feelings. And I think that she wrote a lot about death, and a lot about feelings, and a lot about different ways of experiencing feelings about death. I think, although there's no kind of gloss for her poems, there's no like, this is what I wrote about. So you have to go into this poem knowing a little bit about the culture in which she was writing, where death was maybe more common, and where funeral culture was more pronounced, and perhaps had more distinct features such as drums and the like. But really, what you do is you go in and you try and unpick what it is she's using the image of a funeral to say. And to my mind, when I've taught this poem, and when I read it, you can understand it as various different types of suffering that she's trying to get to pinpoint. But she uses the image of a funeral to get there, and it's in her brain to start with.
Yeah, that's the thing. I felt a funeral in my brain, and I think it's such a compelling image.
She's just genius at this. She's absolutely brilliant at getting these. She puts word to something, or she finds words for something that I've never heard anybody do in a way that I've never read elsewhere. And it's so concise as well. I felt a funeral in my brain, and we all have to kind of sit there and think, okay, what would that feel like? What does it feel like to have a funeral in your brain? And we all know what a funeral is, but obviously your funeral might be different to my funeral. So what she then does is she takes it, in the first two stanzas at least, it stays in the brain, this feeling, but she's emphasising what it felt like. And there's this emphasis on the treading of the mourners back and forth. I find that fantastic. And then the beating of the drum. So it's a very physical.
It's quite a noisy brain.
It's a noisy brain. It's a busy, noisy brain. There's a lot of toing and froing.
It feels like people are stampeding. They're inside her head.
That's right.
And she's trying to get the moment of silence, isn't she?
Well, I don't know whether she's seeking the silence, or whether the silence just comes. That's interesting that you say that. The way that I read it is that they're back and forth, and what's important is that sense was breaking through it. They kept treading till it seemed that sense was breaking through. So I think the way in which she uses the word sense there sort of suggests sensation, not as in good sense, but as in the feeling breaking through into her brain. She's experiencing that. But then in the next stanza there's a numbness. She feels as though her mind is going numb. And I think that, to me, what she's getting at, if we read it as a poem about the suffering of loss, which you can, I think you can do a convincing reading of it that way, she's getting at the full, complete and total sensory experience of that kind of shock, that kind of loss. So to begin with, it's in her brain, and it's kind of, like these people are colonising her brain, marching up and around to and fro, and the drums are beating, and there's that kind of emphatic repetition. She always uses dashes to kind of reiterate this sort of the force of something, drawing attention to that. And there's the numbness, but then it shifts to her soul, and this is what I love about her poetry, because for her, I think there's my experience of reading her is that she doesn't make any kind of false separation between mind and body and soul, and these things are all a part of oneness and human experience. So in the third stanza, when they lift the box, the coffin, it creaks across her soul. Now again, it's like, what would that feel like? What would it feel like if your soul was creaking? It's kind of fascinating and fantastic image, but you know it would hurt, I think, or it would certainly be uncomfortable, that creaking, especially given that the thing that's creaking is the lifting of the coffin. There's the relationship between that image of the coffin and the verb creak, and the boots of lead again, and then there's the silence. And what you get after that is you get sound, you get space kind of tolling or ringing, and all the heavens were a bell, and all of being is an ear, and you get this emphasis on the sense of hearing for that moment. So it's gone from that kind of physical sensory experience of thumping and beating and treading, and then you've got this one after the creaking of the soul, the emphasis on her ears, and then you've got the silence. And I think I don't read it as though she's seeking the silence. I see it as though the silence is kind of where she gets to. And it's in silence that she's wrecked and solitary. It's there in that. It's when those noises have stopped. Now it could be that the creaking across her. So it could read it literally, and the box is now in the ground or heading for the ground. And that moment of kind of realization is one of great shock and great isolation. Really, that silence is her on her own. Suddenly there's no sound, sort of sensory deprivation, a bit like the numbness. But then it goes from that, the kind of wreckedness of the silence, the solitary. I find that very moving, the idea that she's on her own in this. She's on her own in this experience. And then I think this is an incredible last image, and you could read it in so many ways. You could read it as a nervous breakdown. Well, a nervous breakdown is just words we use to describe kind of the bottom dropping out of who you are. For whatever reason, the bottom drops out, and I love the image she has there. A plank in reason broke. It's like all of my reason was balancing on this plank, and the coffin goes over it, or whatever happens, the plank breaks, and then it's like, I'm bottoming out.
I'm quite interested in what sorts of fiction and literature people read when they're feeling depressed or stressed or anxious or heartbroken or lonely. And for some people, they've said, actually, the only person I can read is Emily Dickinson, really? And Sexton and stuff like that, because they are the only people that understand. Other people say, I can't because I can't concentrate, but I can read P.G. Wodehouse. I can read something that is such a perfect, ordered world. I'm also very interested in rhythm, and I just think rhythm. There's a great comfort in rhythm. You talked about her using dashes, and she's quite staccato, isn't she? The way the physical sort of appearance of her poems are very interesting. Yeah. What do you think about?
I feel I have a lot I want to say. What do I want to say? I want to say that her poems are brilliant because they're short, they're concise, and there are lots of poems, in fact, about joy, and they're about moments. I think what's so fascinating is that she can write about a moment or a momentary experience or a fleeting experience. So she can write about the kind of slant of light in a room on an afternoon, and you're there for that moment, but of course then the light will change. So in terms of whether she appeals to someone suffering or not, I think it entirely depends. Her poems are difficult, so it's quite alienating to have to untangle. That's why courses are so great, because they help you try and unpick what's going on to crack that code. And once that's code cracked, there can be a great sense of relief and like, oh, wow, I do know how that feels. Oh my God, So for me, as a teacher again, she can be a great way in to accessing feelings that I want articulated, or I think it's important to articulate.
I almost think I never intellectualise with her. I just let the feelings overtake me. Yeah. I just don't care about really knowing what they mean. And I think the thing about poetry, we don't have to over-intellectualise. No. Sometimes we just feel it. Yes. And I think just feeling it is important.
That speaks to your point about rhythm and metre. And, there's actually quite a kind of strong structure to this poem. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro, and treading till it seemed that sense was breaking through. What she does do, which I like, but perhaps you don't want from one of her poems, but is that she interrupts that rhythm. So her dashes or her half rhyme. So you've got to and fro and then through. So fro rhymes with through, or at the end you've got down. And then you've got these kind of half rhymes or these awkward rhymes, which are jarring. And as a teacher of poetry, I'm excited by that and interested in what that kind of does to the otherwise seamless experience of that kind of tum-ti-tum sort of rhythm, because that's where, you know, when you're jarred by a sound,
you're brought up short,
you're like,
aren't you?
oh, hang on, that doesn't feel right. And we want, I think, often what we want, and don't get me wrong, my favourite thing to do is read trash magazines when I'm sad.
There's nothing wrong with it.
Absolutely.
There's nothing wrong with
things that are, like things that are going to distract me, things that are funny, watch junky
Cartoons,
television, whatever
yeah.
it takes. But reading to mood, or reading for different reasons or at different times, then you can get a much deeper experience. And for me, again, this is a blessing of being a teacher. You know, I have her poetry in my loo, but I wouldn't be reading it on a daily basis if it weren't for that I teach it. And it's by teaching it that I get to kind of sit with it a bit and try and understand it in a bit more detail. And that I get kind of transcendent sometimes experiences, emotional experiences in response to a poem when teaching it, you know, or talking about it like we're doing now, that I wouldn't have got on my own. And that's a really interesting aspect of poetry that at some level is difficult or presents as difficult, because if you can do it together with somebody, and if somebody can help you and you can talk it through and you can kind of hear it and repeat it and listen to it again and unpack it and unpick it, then that kind of the exhilaration that comes with a certain level of understanding, a different level of understanding to that intuitive, goosebumpy, initial kind of connectedness to rhythm and sound, like when we listen to music and we just feel it, you know. Poetry works at that level, and then it can work at this other level as well. And I think picking and mixing when you want to respond to it and how you want to respond to it can be extremely nourishing, actually. It's that flicker of recognition or alienation, you know, if you, it's like, oh, what does it mean? For me, it's a recognition, but I couldn't tell you what it was. I couldn't find other ways of describing it, because that's perfect, isn't it? Like,
it's so perfect.
Whatever it is, that's what it fits. She says, she starts another poem, something like, bandaging my soul, you know, or sometimes the soul has days when it needs bandaging, something like that. And you're just like, oh.
The image just
Yeah.
arrests. It's so arresting.
And it's that thing that she does of taking the everyday, actually, you know, the everyday experience of a funeral, which in fact is quite everyday, and certainly was more everyday in a sense when she was writing, and then making it, using it, something easily visualizable or easily identifiable to a reader, and then using that same image to get to some experience of the interior world that's so hard to give language to. And like you say, it's difficult to understand. We don't even really need to understand, which I'm just glad she wrote it down, because I can have that flicker of recognition.